What's going on, gamers? Welcome to 3.0. Today I wanted to teach you guys about Dendro reactions and what teams you can build around different Dendro gimmicks. These aren't going to be 100% best teams all the time, but hopefully you can walk away from this video with some idea of strong Dendro teams and how they'll work. Before we get started, I wanted to give a huge thanks to the entire TC community, Zajef, KQM, Kusanali mains, other content creators who collaborated, and everyone who helped me do math personally. I also go live a few days a week at twitch.tv/Braxophone. I'll be live during the week of Sumeru patch, so if you want to come ask questions or just see things being tested live, make sure to come check it out. With all that being said, my name is Braxophone, and let's talk about Dendro. We currently have 3 Dendro characters, and though I'll be making a video for each one of them, it's good to know which ones are good and bad at Dendro application. Forgive my pronunciation on this, it's about to be terrible. Tighnari isn't really meant to be a Dendro player or a main DPS. He's sort of just in a weird quick swap but takes up short field time anyways position. Most of the time, he's gonna be the one triggering reactions instead of applying Dendro for others to trigger. Now, Kale is in a weird spot because for some reason, her burst doesn't really follow standard internal cooldown. Internal cooldown is the frequency at which a character can apply an element to an enemy, and Kale has a standard 2.5 seconds, but not the standard 3 hits. So what that means is that she can only apply Dendro 3 times per her burst, which is pretty bad overall. This is going to limit her usability as a Dendro support to only a couple of teams if you try to be optimal. The third Dendro unit is going to be the MC, the main character. It's easy to dismiss Aether and Lumine due to them being free starting characters, but they actually aren't too bad in most of their elements. The only reason Electro MC isn't used is because Fischl and Raiden exist, and the only reason that Geo MC isn't used is because Albedo exists. Ultimately, if you don't have access to those units, MC provides a pretty solid alternative. The cool thing is that with Dendro, the Traveler actually has the best Dendro application of the current Dendro roster. It's likely that Kusanali will probably do it better because the Traveler is a lesser version of the Archon characters, but for now, Dendro MC is a completely free-to-play character that does the job of Dendro support very well. All of their constellations are also going to be free, they can use Favonia's sword for battery, and their damage for being an enabler isn't really that bad either. So if you're going to build a Dendro unit, I'd recommend building up Dendro MC to level 90 to maximize utility and reaction damage because they're going to be great for Dendro and they're also sort of future-proof since they change elements. For this video, most of the teams are going to feature MC. The first and one of the best Dendro reactions is gonna be Bloom, which activates when you have Hydro and Dendro coexisting on an enemy. Bloom will spawn a Dendro core that looks like a little green seed, and that seed can do one of 3 things. It can blow up on its own, it can be triggered by Pyro, or it can be hyper bloomed, which is Electro. If you don't apply any elements to it and just wait a short amount of time, it will deal Bloom damage after blowing up as a result of its timer expiring or a new core being spawned. All Bloom reactions deal Dendro damage, so the new artifact set Deepwood Memories will make them stronger by shredding Dendro resistance. Now, something sort of crazy about Dendro is that it doesn't react with CRYO at all, and that means a few things. 1, you can reverse melt with burning, and 2, you can run freeze with Dendro and still bloom. And you can use the second point to actually improve Dendro teams. The way elemental gauges work with dual element auras, for example, something like Electro and Hydro on an enemy, when you react with Pyro, the Pyro will eliminate the Electro first before it can get to the Hydro and vaporize. If the Pyro is strong enough, it can do both, but usually there will be Hydro left over regardless. The same thing applies to freeze with Dendro. When you apply Hydro and CRYO to an enemy, they get the freezing aura, which is actually different from CRYO or Hydro. When you apply Hydro to an enemy, it has to go through the freezing aura first to get to the Dendro one, making it affect the Dendro aura on enemies less. This allows you to get multiple blooms out of a Dendro aura before it's removed from an enemy. On top of that, in a freeze team, enemies will be stuck in place to wait for the blooms to blow up. Zajef calls this concept fridge, and it's basically because you're putting your vegetables, or Dendro, in the fridge, which keeps them cold and maintains the aura longer. It's actually a super solid team concept, and it's really fun in execution. A fridge team consists of a Dendro applier, CRYO applier, Hydro applier, and a flex. The team that I like to use is Dendro MC, Rosaria, Kokomi, and Kazuha. And in this team, you can definitely replace Kazuha with Venti or Sucrose. Kokomi's healing is still solid with a full EM build. Kazuha debuffs cryo resistance and helps group Dendro cores because because they can be moved with Animo, and Rosaria deals high cryo damage. You'll notice that all of the blooms deal over 20k damage when they blow up, and that's due to Kokomi's elemental mastery. In a fridge team, you want to give your Hydro character a full elemental mastery build with the Gilded Dream set, because they'll take ownership of all of the Dendro cores produced when an enemy is frozen. Now, as for flexibility, this team concept can exist with tons of different units. There's a variation of the team with no main damage dealer where you substitute Rosaria for Diona, which is pretty funny by itself, but if you don't want to do that, you can also just bring Diona or Sucrose instead of Kazuha if you want to share elemental mastery. For the cryo damage dealer, most cryo characters will work. I've just found Rosaria to be pretty easy to plug and play. And as for Hydro units, you can use any of them, but the best characters for it will be Childe, Xingqiu, Yelan, and Kokomi for their very consistent Hydro application. Lastly, this is one of the few teams Kale really excels in because their Dendro application isn't amazing, but because we're fridging, the Dendro aura is going to last for more hits. And lastly, as for sets, you want to make sure that you give Dendro MC or Kale the Deepwood Memories set. Alternatively to Bloom, by applying Pyro to the core, you'll trigger Burgeon, which deals AoE Dendro damage to both nearby enemies and yourself. The self damage is pretty reduced, but it's nearly impossible to play a good Burgeon team without shields or healing. This mostly was meant to try and take attention off of Pyro reactions, but Burgeon isn't a bad one to use, and actually gives the lesser used units like Thoma a way to deal solid damage and get use out of his kit. Burgeon teams are an interesting concept, not the most broken teams, but definitely still fun to play. Right now, they're pretty limited if you want to get value out of them, but I've had a lot of fun using Thoma for high damage. If you use someone like Kokomi, Childe, Xingqiu, Yelan, Barbara, most of the gameplay is with Kokomi, but almost any Hydro unit will work. Alongside Dendro MC, you can create a ton of Dendro cores, and Thoma is able to blow them all up because of a lack of ICD, which is how often a character can apply an element to an enemy. Now, to clarify, Thoma does have internal cooldown, ICD, but the cores only take one hit each to blow up, so effectively Thoma has no ICD at all in that situation. A full elemental mastery Thoma can still shield consistently enough to block out Burgeon's self damage while also blowing up for tons of Dendro damage. In this situation, I definitely recommend giving your Dendro character the Deepwood Memories set and giving Thoma the Gilded Dreams set. That way enemies' resistance to Dendro is being shred and Thoma has tons of elemental mastery. Now once again, Burgeon is pretty dang limited. Right now the best Dendro player is Dendro MC, but the problem is that Dendro MC's flower that they spawn in the middle can actually be destroyed by Xiangling and Thoma, and though you can definitely play around it if you're good at the game, it can be a little bit tougher to deal with, so just keep that in mind for the future Burgeon teams I'm going to recommend. That Burgeon can be fun, and especially when new Dendro characters come out that don't have that little seed that can just instantly be destroyed in the middle of their burst, Burgeon will be a lot better. Regardless of that, we're still going to talk about some other Burgeon team options. Now, you might be wondering about Xiangling, since she is the premier free-to-play Pyro that's normally used with Childe. I personally like using Thoma because I get enjoyment out of using underused characters to clear content, but Xiangling would be better by a long shot. If you play what I like to call intergrational, with a Dendro replacing your Animo, you can run a normal Xiangling build with an Elemental Mastery Sands to deal amazing personal damage with Xiangling while also hitting a decent amount of Burgeon damage. Childe's Hydro application is so strong that you should never really have any issues. The one downside to this team is that the self damage will absolutely obliterate you without being in Bennett's field, so that's something to keep in mind. But alternatively to that, even you could use something like Kazuha and Kokomi instead of Bennett and Childe, and that would allow you to have a healer and someone to group up enemies, so that's just something to think about. There's lots of variations you can do to this, you just need to make sure that you have a high enough Hydro application to beat out Thoma or Xiangling's Pyro. Burgeon is a fun concept, and honestly I can see it getting a lot better with newer units down the line, but even right now it seems pretty good. The last of the Bloom reactions is going to happen when you attack a core with Electro. When you hit one of the seeds with Electro, that triggers Hyper Bloom. And essentially Hyper Bloom is just a homing Bloom reaction. It's just going to send Dendro damage towards an enemy and it's going to track them down. The one downside to this is that it is single target, which means that though it probably won't miss, I do think there's been one or two instances where it has, it's not going to blow up and deal tons of AoE damage, so you are limiting the amount of enemies that you can hit a little bit. But the fact that it chases down targets makes it at least a little consistent. There's a lot of terminology that seems confusing at first with Electro and Dendro, but it's not all too bad. Outside of Hyper Bloom, all you need to know is that if you combine Electro and Dendro, the enemy becomes quickened. Against quickened enemies, your next Electro or Dendro attack will deal bonus damage that scales with Elemental Mastery. If you hit with Electro, it's aggravate damage, and if you hit with Dendro, it's spread damage. There's no difference in these except for the type of damage they do. Aggravate's Electro, spread is Dendro. All Hyper Bloom teams are also Quicken teams, but not all Quicken teams are Hyper Bloom teams. To make a Hyper Bloom team, you need a Hydro, but for Quicken teams, you may not use one at all. That being said, a lot of times using a Hyper Bloom team with some Quicken options is pretty good. Electro benefits a ton from the existence of Dendro, and you can tell by how many characters saw huge buffs. For example, Fischl was an amazing unit before, but now she deals even higher damage due to both Aggravate and her Ascension 4 passive that deals extra damage and has no internal cooldown, which essentially just means it can proc more reactions. You'll definitely want to level her up to 90 if you want to get the most damage out of her, because all of the Dendro reactions scale with your level pretty hard. On top of that, other characters like Kuki and Yaimiko who get value out of Elemental Mastery will also deal more solid damage now. So let me show you what I mean. There's tons of solid teams for this. Electro and Dendro is a field day. For a Hyper Bloom team, I've been enjoying Keqing, Yelan, Kazuha, and Dendro MC, with Yelan being replaceable by Xingqiu. It's not a broken team, and it's definitely not the best, but it allows you to play Keqing, a previously low tier unit, for damage. It also allows Keqing to use the 4-piece Thundering Fury set, which got buffed to improve Dendro reaction damage and also get more Electro uptime. It also activates on Dendro reactions now, so overall Thundering Fury became a significantly more useful set. In this case, I gave my Keqing an Elemental Mastery stance, but outside of that, there's options like using Ayato on field with Fischl in place of Keqing, where you'll be able to dish out insane damage in short bursts. I find that with Quicken and Aggravate teams, if you're gonna have a main damage dealer, as long as they were okay before, they're pretty good now, as long as they fit into that archetype of Hydro, Electro, or Dendro. The main thing you need to know about Hyper Bloom teams is that you just need to have solid Hydro, Dendro, and Electro application. A ton of reaction damage comes out of Hyper Bloom teams, and even without mega buffing your carry, you can still deal really high damage. Alternatively, for teams that focus on Quicken, Aggravate, and Spread, but not Hyper Bloom, you have a few options, but my personal favorite is with Tignari. You don't need him for this, but he's pretty good at it. Essentially, this team has everything dealing solid damage. I play Tignari, Fischl, Yaimiko, and Kazuha. Though you can't really control who's getting buffed at any given time, each buff will add up to be insane damage. Since Yai has EM scaling, giving her the new Elemental Mastery set can be super beneficial, and giving Tignari the Dendro set can improve his personal damage by a lot. Fischl will also proc tons of Aggravate, and overall the damage from this team is just kind of insane. There's no healer in it, which I haven't found to be a huge problem since Tignari shoots fast enough to where you can dodge between shots, but if you want a healer, you can always replace Yai with Kuki, who can actually add quite a bit of damage to this team with a full EM setup. The nice thing about Quicken teams is that they're really forgiving if you don't do the rotation right, because they're really focused on activating reactions as often as possible rather than controlling them perfectly. I really enjoy these types of teams. If you're hoping that Pyro DPS are getting a huge buff with burning, technically you're not wrong, they are buffed in a way. But compared to how many other buffs characters are getting, Pyro doesn't really stand out a ton. For example, Reverse Melt. Burning is not super strong, and its Pyro application got nerfed when Sumeru released, which means it's going to go out pretty quickly and make it strictly worse than using someone like Xiangling or Kazuha to get more Reverse Melts overall. If you're going to run a burning team, you'll likely be better off applying that Pyro with an Anemo character by swirling it to cause its damage to scale off the Anemo's Elemental Mastery, like Kazuha for example. You could also use overload teams like something with Dendro MC or Tignari, Bennett, Kazuha, and Fischl, and you'll deal pretty solid damage. It's not going to be the top team or anything, but overload, burning, and swirl damage you get in conjunction with Aggravate and Spread do let that sort of team dish out a bunch of numbers. With that team specifically, if you don't have Kazuha, you can use Sucrose or Venti, but generally speaking, Hazo won't be as good because he lacks grouping. And when you're playing overload teams, you absolutely need grouping or range damage if you're not against a boss. So if you're trying to utilize burning for something, an overload team isn't too bad, and in this team specifically, you don't really need to use the Dendro Shred set unless you're playing Tignari. But again, with an overload burning kind of setup, you don't really need Tignari, you can also use other Dendro as well. I'm personally pretty bummed that burning got nerfed because I was looking forward to some new ways to play Pyro, but it's also pretty cool that we get to move towards a new meta entirely, so let me know know in the comments what you're thinking, if you like any of these new reactions, or if you have any idea of what kind of team you're going to be playing. To be clear, a lot of past meta teams are still meta, and the existence of Dendro doesn't take that away. It just opens up even more opportunities for team building and makes characters more flexible. I'm really looking forward to seeing what other interactions we come up with as we play with Dendro more, but until then, I hope this guide taught you something new and encouraged you to try some new teams. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you've enjoyed, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video so YouTube knows it doesn't suck. Reminder that I go live on Twitch a few days a week at twitch.tv/Braxophone. Make sure to come check it out if you have any questions, you want to see Genshin Impact gameplay, or just any games really. Until then, I'll catch you guys next time.